He's a funny guy.
Oh, here it is. He's right here. Oh, you're the speaker. I recognize you from your haircut. And this guy here has swum with these guys too. Over Hawaii.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight, for our October lecture for Exploration. I'm Tom Pollock. I'm your CEO of Exploration, and I'm your warm-up act for a few minutes while we get Josh ready and wired up. And first I want to say thank you to the Winslow Manta Trust and you all for being members to help support tonight's efforts and helps defray the cost for all the mailers and things that we do to make this successful. Tonight, the Manta Rays, how many people here have know much about Manta Rays? Few? Okay. Anybody ever seen one in the wild? Quite a few of you, okay. And so that Manta Ray right there, if it was dropped in this room, would pretty much fill the room. It's that big, several tons, and it's really quite amazing. So let me give you a little bit of background on Josh's credentials. He talked at 4 o'clock and had just a lot of questions. So in case you don't know, he's a marine biologist and an underwater videographer. He has studied and filmed mantas around the world. For his degree in marine biology, Josh spent several years studying coral recruitment on historic ships in the Dominican Republic. It was during one of these projects that he saw his first manta ray, fell in love, and instantly taken by the beauty and grace of these amazing animals. As a Rolex scholar, which is something we talked about over dinner right before that, which is very difficult to get, Josh spent a year traveling the world working with really the leading filmmakers, biologists, and conservationists to gain a real-world perspective on one of the more pressing marine conservation issues of our day. And he'll get into that in more detail and explain that point. Despite working with charismatic megafauna such as great white sharks and all the big creatures of the ocean, whales and such, Josh was really drawn to manta rays after a time that he went in the Maldive Islands, and he's now dedicated to understanding and protecting these amazing creatures. So there's part of Exploration here in Newport Beach is talking about the conservation and preservation of marine animals, one of the principles of ocean literacy. Anyway, Josh has filmed for National Geographic and Animal Planet, as well as producing a number of independent documentaries on his own and video shorts, one of which earned him the Australian Geographic Spirit of Adventure Award in 2010. I think that's when he was a little kid, because Josh is a young guy, and he's done a lot in his life already at this point. He's currently a PhD student at Scripps Institute of Oceanography down south in La Jolla, and he's being supported by the National Science Foundation Fellowship for his research on manta ray. So it's my pleasure, and I'm very proud to introduce Mr. Josh Stewart. Oh, and he is the Associate Director of the Manta Ray Trust. I don't want to forget that. Josh, take it away from here, sir.
Thanks, Tom. All right, it's going to be hard to live up to that intro. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to tell you all about manta rays. We'll start with what we know about them. We'll talk about what we don't know about them, what we really need to know about them. And then I'll tell you about the research that we're doing at Scripps to help fill those knowledge gaps. So let's start off with what we know. So it sounds like a lot of you guys have seen mantas. You probably don't need this refresher, but for anybody who hasn't, mantas are an elasmobranch. So elasmobranchs are an ancient group of animals. They include sharks and rays. They're several 100 million years old. And manta rays fall into about half of that group of elasmobranchs, the rays. And when we think about rays, we typically think of these bottom dwellers, right? These stingrays and skates, electric rays, that sort of thing. We usually think about the animal that killed Steve Irwin and think that they're very dangerous.
More species.
But manta rays are quite different from these guys. So all these rays that we're looking at here, and the majority of rays, they're bottom dwellers, they're sessile, they don't move that much. And they share in common these crunching jaws. Instead of having teeth, they have these flat plates that allow them to suck up crustaceans and other hard animals in the substrate and crunch them so that they can actually eat and digest them. So if we take an evolutionary step away from these bottom-dwelling rays, we get to the family Myliobatidae. And these guys, I'm sure many of you are familiar with. We get these bat rays right off the coast here in California. In the summer months, people step on them all the time, and they get some barbs in their feet. So these rays, they're a little bit different from the bottom dwellers. They still spend some time on the bottom, but now you see they're diamond shaped. They're adapted to be up in the water column to swim around. But they share with their ancestors and their relatives those same crushing plates. So these guys are still adapted to bury down into the sediment, suck up crustaceans, and crunch them. So now we're on the right track. We're going to take one more evolutionary step, and now we get to the family Mobulidae, and that includes the Manta and Mobula rays. And so most people don't even know that these two groups exist. They all think that they're all manta rays, and that if you see a small manta, it's probably a baby manta or something like that. But most of the time, it's actually a completely different species, which is the Mobula. So we have 9 species of Mobulas throughout the world's oceans, and we have 2 described species of manta rays, and probably one more, which is in the process of being described. So these are a few different species of Mobulas on the left, and we have the oceanic and the reef manta ray here on the right. And for the rest of the talk, I'm really going to be focused almost entirely on these 2 species of manta rays. So let's dive into them a little bit more. Where can we find them? Manta rays are tropical and temperate species, so you won't find them at the poles. You won't find them in really cold water, but you will find them basically all over the world. Anywhere you get in the water, you've got some chance of seeing manta rays as long as you're in tropical and temperate waters. Oceanic manta rays are truly cosmopolitan. You find them everywhere in the world. And reef manta rays you find in the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, but they don't actually extend past Hawaii. So Hawaii is the last place that you can see reef mantas before you hit Mexico and the US. What do they look like? So they're actually really similar. On the left, we've got reef mantas. On the right, we have oceanic manta rays. And you might not be surprised to hear that we actually didn't know that these were 2 separate species until 2009, when they were first described as 2 separate species. And that's partly because, as their names suggest, you don't see them together too often, so not many people could actually compare the 2 side by side. Reef mantas tend to be on reef habitats. Oceanic mantas tend to be in pelagic habitats, seamounts over deep water. But once you have some pictures of them side by side, you can see that there are differences, subtle differences in their dorsal coloration. So oceanic mantas have much more defined white shoulder patches. Reef mantas have a more gradual gradient into the black. There are also differences in their coloration patterns on their bellies. Oceanic mantas don't have any spots between their gill slits. They've got these really dark bands that are trailing their pectoral fins. Reef mantas have spots all over the place, and they don't tend to have those bands. Another big difference between these guys, which might be the one that you realize first if you were to see a couple of them, is that they're very different sizes. So reef manta rays top out around 4 meters in disc width. So that's wingspan, essentially. So that's about 15 feet across. That's a big animal. Oceanic mantas, the largest ever reported was 8.3 meters across. So that's about 25 feet. That's more than 25 feet. That's an animal about the size of this alcove here, right? And so to give you an idea, this isn't the best picture in the world, but it gives you a feel for what it looks like when you're sitting there and there's a manta bearing down on you. And this is actually kind of a small one, right? This is an oceanic manta.
They are big.
That guy's probably, 12 to 15 feet across. So they get almost double that size. Incredibly large animals, really a pleasure to be in the water with these guys. And in addition to their large body size, this is a historical image. So this is a manta that was caught in the early 1900s. It weighed over 5,000 pounds, and that's about 20 feet across. So they're big, and with that big size comes what we think is quite great intelligence. So mantas have big brains. Not every big animal has a big brain. Whale sharks, which are a similar species to manta, have very small brains. But we can use this metric, which is brain to body mass ratio, to give us some idea of how smart an animal could be. So it's not a perfect indicator of intelligence, but it gives us some idea of the range that we might expect. And manta rays have the largest brain to body mass ratio of any fish. And they extend into the brain to body mass ratio that you'd expect in mammals. So that gives us an idea that they have the potential to be really, really smart. Along with a big brain, they have a very developed brain. So you guys have all seen images of human brains, and they're all sort of crinkly, and they have lots of surface area, which just allows the chemical reactions to happen and for us to think quite a bit more than somebody who has a flat brain. And mantas have those same developments. They have that same increased surface area, which you don't find in a lot of other sharks and rays. The parts of their brains that are highly developed and enlarged are the same parts of our brains that we associate with problem solving, social interactions, and other complex thoughts. So a lot of evidence is supporting the idea that mantas are really smart animals. So they're big, they're smart, they're also long-lived. So here we've got a couple of photos of the same manta, and we can look at the spot patterns on their belly to identify a manta. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But here's the same manta photographed first in 1989 and again in 2012. And we've got records of similar gaps that are up to 30 or 40 years. So we know that mantas live at least about 40 years and probably more like 50 or 60 years. So they're big, they're smart, they're long-lived, they don't sound that much like a fish, right? So the way that we look at these guys and can track an individual animal is with those spot patterns. And every manta has a spot pattern that it's born with and which never changes across its entire life. And that's its fingerprint. And that allows us to do a lot of really interesting things like estimate populations, to look at individual movements just based on photos. And it also lets us track things like how often a manta becomes pregnant. So what we know from looking at, you can actually see when a manta gets pregnant. That's a huge bulge there. So they probably have a sore back when they're pregnant as well. And we can also look at evidence of pregnancies and mating, even when we don't see a pregnancy itself, which are these mating scars. And what we found by looking at these is that a manta becomes pregnant or gives birth about every 5 to 7 years, which is not very often. And it only gives birth to one pup at a time. Occasionally there have been reports of mantas who were caught and had twins inside, but one pup every 7 years is a really slow population growth rate, or a very low fecundity. And just to put that in perspective, great white sharks, which are considered a really slow growing and also low fecundity animal, they give birth to about 14 pups in a single litter every couple of years. And so great white sharks give birth to as many offspring in one pregnancy as mantas might give birth in their entire lifespan. So they're slow growing, they're large, they're smart. When these mantas pop out, they come out as a little manta burrito. And from day one, they're completely self-sufficient. There's no maternal care that we can find. The juveniles also seem to segregate themselves from the adults. You never seem to see juvenile mantas alongside adult mantas. And fisheries, for example, find many juveniles, but not so many adults in some cases. So it seems that there is spatial segregation between the age classes. So you might be wondering how a manta becomes pregnant. Is there a stork equivalent or something along those lines? And the answer is no. What we get instead are these mating trains. So up front here is a large female, and she's being courted by about half a dozen males. So another analog to humans, right? Yeah. And what she's doing here is she's trying to get rid of about 5 of those 6 males, which is also pretty typical for us. And so what this female manta will do is she'll lead all of these males on a chase across the reef. And this can last 2, 3, 4 days. And she'll swim at top speed. She'll basically be going through an obstacle course of her choosing. And what she's trying to do is weed out the males that can't keep up with her. So one by one, they'll say, okay, it's not worth it. You know, you're not that pretty, I'll stay, I'll find another one. Until finally, she's whittled it down to 1 male. And presumably the male that can keep up with her is the most fit male that she will then breed with. So then, cover your eyes if you're under 18, what actually happens at copulation, these mantas, they don't have hands, you know, they can't cuddle or anything. So they swim, the male swims up to the female, and he grabs always her left pectoral fin with his mouth. And so mantas don't have teeth. Their teeth have evolved into these little sandpaper-like pads on the upper and lower jaws. And that allows the male to grip the pectoral fin, which is what causes those mating scars that we looked at before. And then he can flip himself belly to belly where they do the deed. And you often get jealous suitors coming in and trying to dislodge the act and sneak in there. So really interesting thing about these guys, mantas are negatively buoyant. They have to constantly be swimming in order to both breathe and to stay afloat. And so when they copulate, they swim almost to the surface, and then they start to breed and they sink while they're doing it until they almost hit the bottom. So it's the only time that you would ever probably see a manta that stops moving entirely. So these mating trains are often mistaken for what we have here on the left, which is a feeding train. And the giveaway here is that in this case, this manta's cephalic fins are unfurled and their mouths are open. So the way that mantas feed, they're actually filter feeders. So they're feeding on some of the smallest organisms in the ocean, zooplankton, so little copepods and krill and that sort of thing. And they open up their mouth and they channel a huge amount of water through their gills, across their gill rakers, and they strain out these the zooplankton. So they're basically living sieves. And so they have a number of different strategies to feed. First of all, they have these cephalic fins which help channel more water into their mouths, but they also have behavioral adaptations to help them maximize their feeding efficiency. So here on the left, the reason that these mantas have formed a chain to feed is that you get mantas that are stacked above and behind each other. If you're a zooplankton and you're a couple millimeters across, you don't have a whole lot of defensive mechanisms, but they can actually move vertically quite fast. So they jump out of the way when a manta comes and tries to eat them. But when they jump up, there's another manta waiting right behind them, and they'll be scooped right in there, and you might have a third manta and sometimes a fourth. So that's a cooperative feeding behavior that also sort of hints at quite interesting intelligence. They can also feed on their own using some really beautiful and famous behavior, which are these barrel rolls. So if a manta swims through a particularly dense patch of plankton that they want to hit again and feed on, they'll actually do a 360-degree barrel roll and then just keep going through that same patch again and again and again until they're satisfied. Now finally, my most interesting one and my favorite is what we call cyclone feeding behavior. And this only happens in one place in the entire world, which is in the Maldives. And there's a really small bay that, because of monsoonal winds and the lunar cycle and plankton blooms that are happening across the Maldives, this one little bay gets huge swarms of zooplankton that are trapped in there for a couple hours a day. And that attracts hundreds, literally hundreds of manta rays. So you can have up to 250 of these reef manta rays, which are each 12 to 15 feet across, in a bay the size of a football field. And what they're doing is they're not just feeding randomly on their own, they're forming a cyclone. So they'll get, tip to tail, and they'll rotate from the surface all the way down to the sea floor about 60 feet below. And what they're doing is they're actually creating a current in the water that's sucking water into that vortex. And what we think they're doing is that they're concentrating the zooplankton that's already very dense in that bay so that they can maximize their feeding efficiency as they spiral around. So that is really complex, very, very neat cooperative feeding behavior that you don't normally see in a fish. And this is actually one of the only instances in any sort of animal, both marine and terrestrial, where you have evidence of an animal shaping its physical environment to its benefit. And it's a fish. I mean, it's incredible. So along with the feeding, and related to the feeding, we see that mantas are also quite prolific divers. So these are some dive profiles from reef manta rays, and you'll see, if you look at the scale on the left, that they're diving down 300, 400 meters quite regularly. So over 1,000 feet deep. We also have data from oceanic mantas. They're making dives almost down to 1 kilometer, and they're frequently diving down below 200 and 300 meters. Most impressive is Mobula terrapecana, which is a relative. We talked about mobulas earlier. These guys will dive down to almost 2,000 meters, and in some cases, they'll stay there for 3 or 4 hours. So what are these guys doing? Why are they swimming down to depths that are, 4 or 5 degrees Celsius, dark, uninhabitable? Well, what we think they're doing is actually feeding down there. So there's this phenomenon in the ocean called the deep scattering layer. And what this is a dense layer that's about 100 meters thick of fish and zooplankton. And these guys, during the day, so here, for example, is a day, they live deep. So they live in deep, dark oceans where they can avoid predators that rely on sight. And then at night, they migrate up to the surface where they can feed while still being safe from these same visual predators. So this is perhaps the largest migration on Earth, and it happens every single day all over the world. And we're pretty sure that mantas are accessing that deep scattering layer by diving really deep during the day and feeding on the upper layer of that zooplankton. And we have some observations from submersibles of mantas feeding on this layer. And we're working on getting National Geographic's critter cams deployed on these mantas so we can actually observe it firsthand from a manta's perspective. So mantas feed on these tiny little organisms, and they feed on so many of them that they're able to get huge. And they get so big that they have very few natural predators. But they do have a few. So anybody have a guess what left this guy looking unhappy here? A shark, yeah, that was easy. So sharks are the main predator of mantas, but in most cases they get away with a pretty bad, gnarly scar, but they still come out alive. Now, if they get into an unfortunate situation with an orca, they usually don't come out okay. And we have a number of documented cases of orcas feeding on mantas. So this looks pretty bad, but actually mantas have this miraculous ability to heal themselves. So on the bottom left, we've got a manta that's got a pretty big chunk bitten out of him. And then here we have that same exact manta, again, identified with those spots on his belly, who has almost completely healed that huge chunk in less than a year. Wow. So this seems to be unique to their pectoral fins. So if they lose one of their cephalic fins, it doesn't grow back. And interestingly, if they lose a fin tip, it also doesn't seem to grow back. But this trailing edge, possibly because that's the part that gets bitten off most often, does seem to grow back. And we see more evidence of these attacks naturally in areas that have more sharks. So the frequency of mantas that have these bites increases in very sharky places like South Africa and Mozambique, and you see less of it in places like Mexico, just because there aren't as many sharks around that are trying to get a free bite of a manta. So when they have a big gash like that, it's likely that they'll be visiting cleaning stations quite frequently. So cleaning stations are sort of like the doctor's office or the dentist's office of the sea. So all sorts of pelagic animals, animals that live off the reef in open water, including mantas and sharks and other large animals, they come to typically these reef areas where you have hundreds and thousands of these small cleaner fish. And so these cleaner fish will swim up on the manta, they'll pick off parasites. If they have a wound, they'll clean that wound, get any little critters living in the wound off. You'll see here as well, they even swim inside the mouth and gills and will do the full detail, everything. I think they pay extra for that. Now these cleaning stations are also really important for socialization. So we see mantas doing mating trains and other sort of courtship activities at these cleaning stations frequently. And you will just see them hanging out at cleaning stations, cruising around with each other, not doing any active cleaning. So this cleaning behavior and this tendency to come to cleaning stations quite reliably makes mantas a really big tourism draw. So you have people that can basically go and sit at a cleaning station and pretty much reliably expect a manta to show up there at certain sites. So that's led to quite a bit of manta tourism all over the world for both species, so much so in some cases that they're trying to get away from all these tourists. And as a result, manta tourism is a booming economic driver, especially in a lot of developing countries. So we've got $140 million per year generated by manta tourism, and a lot of that money is going to coastal communities in developing countries where $10 million a year is a huge amount of money. Now, in addition to using mantas in tourism, as with most marine species, they're also targeted in fisheries. So in the last 10 years or so, mantas have been specifically targeted for their gill rakers, which is what's being held right here. And remember, that's the part that allows them to strain zooplankton out of the water. So their gill rakers are dried, and they're sent to China, where they're used as a traditional remedy.
Shop. It sells anything from under the sea, including what we're looking for. Manta gill plates cost $420 a kilogram here, 2.5 times more than in Sri Lanka, and similar to the price of mid-ranged shark fins. Liang Yongchao swears by their medicinal benefits.
嗱，呢啲棚魚菜咧，我哋自細咧細路哥出馬，咁啊當佢出完馬之後咧，就一定要買嚟食嘅。
用什麼方式來準備這種所謂的藥材？
咁咧呢啲可以清熱散毒，可以用佢煲粥煲水嚟飲，亦都可以咧用芫茜水煲佢，愛嚟抹身沖涼。
你怎麼知道分量用多少？
呢啲係民間嘅驗方嘅啫，差唔多嗱呢度咧咁一塊咁啊分2次啊3次咁咯，細路哥小朋友數十年來都係咁噶啦。咁啊大人咧，你有暗瘡啊之類咧，都可以清熱毒嘅。
這個有中醫的根據嗎？
中醫啦，好多樣嘢都係早上傳落嚟嘅驗方，你話有咩根據啦？咁我真係唔曉講喎。
So this is what we call a pseudo-remedy, because as you saw there, it's used to treat measles, acne, respiratory issues, pretty much anything you can think of. And that's usually a pretty good indicator that it doesn't treat much of anything. So it's just cartilage, and there's no proven medicinal value to these gill rakers, and yet demand is soaring for these gill rakers. So this is one stall in one wholesale dried seafood market in Guangzhou province in China, and these gill rakers represent literally thousands of animals. So there's huge demand, there's huge supply now, where fisheries are developing for these animals all over the world. And so this is a, please ignore the scale on the left there. This is just reported landings. And so the number of animals landed in that scale are basically meaningless, because there's a huge number that's much larger than this that goes unreported. But the trend is probably consistent, and that's what's worrying. And so what we're seeing is, in the last 10 years or so, landings of mobulid rays are just absolutely skyrocketing, specifically in response to this demand for their gill rakers in traditional Chinese medicine. So what's happening to manta populations? Well, the short answer is that we don't really know. But there's a little bit of new evidence that's just come out in the last year, and I'll just direct your attention to this box up on the top right. So this is basically saying that in all of these areas which were surveyed by divers, so this is a historical survey of divers and how often they see manta and mobula rays, there's a clear pattern where people are seeing fewer manta and mobulas over the last 10 or 20 years. Now, that's not perfect, right? That's not, we want more than that. So we know that there has to be a decline happening. So we know that from a theoretical perspective, because mantas produce so few offspring, they live so long, they have such a long time until they reach maturity, that there's absolutely no way that their population growth rates can sustain that kind of fishery. We also have some indirect evidence, which I just showed you, that mantas are declining or populations are declining. But what we really want to know is how far along are we in this process? So how many mantas do we have left before these populations completely collapse? And so if you go to a fisherman or a manager, it's a really different story if you tell them that your manta population is going to disappear in a year or it's going to disappear in 20 years. And it's a very different situation how you then handle that from a management perspective. We also want to know not about these global general trends, which are very useful, but we want to know about specific populations. So how far along is the population in Mexico? Are we about to lose them? What about the population in Indonesia or Sri Lanka? So to get this data, what we are looking for ultimately is a population trend. And what we need for that, this is really simplified, but you need to know how many mantas you actually have to start with, how fast that population is growing, and then you subtract out how many mantas are being fished every year. So it's difficult, it's challenging to figure out how many are being fished every year, but we can observe that. We can go and find that out. We also have some ideas about population growth rates, which we just talked about, but we really have no idea how many mantas we're starting with. And that's a problem. So to figure that out, the first thing we need to know is what are we actually estimating? What is a population of mantas? Otherwise, we don't know if we're estimating a global population or if we're estimating Indonesia's population or if we're estimating, Long Beach's population. And we can, once we have that information, we can use those photo IDs with some mathematical models to estimate the actual population size. So what I'm going to focus on for the rest of this talk is our research behind this question, which is what exactly is a population? And I'm going to be talking about oceanic mantas for the most part, because that's what our research is focused on, mainly because that's the species that's targeted most by these fisheries. There go my sunglasses. All right, so here we've got a bunch of hotspots, we'll call them. Okay, so these are places that we know we can go and find oceanic manta rays, but we don't know if they're a population or what exactly they are. And what we want to know is when we take into account these fisheries, so in Indonesia and Sri Lanka, India, Peru, and elsewhere, how is this fishery, for example, going to impact our population in Ecuador or Peru? So what we're interested in here is connectivity. And these are some hypothetical situations just so we can think about not only what does it mean from a population estimation point of view, but also what does it mean for conservation and for how these species will be impacted. So in this hypothetical scenario, we've got mantas that are swimming from Mexico to Mozambique. So they're living up to the paradigm of these highly migratory ocean wanderers. So this is better in some ways for this global population. So what it means is that despite having a really large fishery in Indonesia, if you're fishing there heavily, you're going to have mantas from Mexico coming in, from Ecuador, from Mozambique. They're going to be in some way replacing the animals that you pull out of Indonesia. So that's not so good for the global population because you're never safe anywhere, basically. You have some chance of swimming through Indonesia and being fished. It's better for these local populations because it means they're not going to be fished out quite as quickly. They've got some sort of buffer in that they have this global population feeding into them. And again, let's go back to tourism. So tourism is providing that economic incentive to not fish mantas. So we want to think about all these scenarios in the context of economic incentives. And this is better for tourism because, again, if you're a dive operator in Indonesia and you make your living going out and showing people mantas in Indonesia, you don't have so much to worry about from that fishery in your country because you've got mantas from elsewhere coming to replace those animals that are removed. Now, of course, the opposite end of the spectrum is that there's absolutely no connectivity between these regions, and they have pretty much mirror consequences. So this is better for the global population because, in effect, these areas that don't have fisheries are protected. If you don't have a fishery, you have nothing to worry about. That's not good for these local populations because they're likely much smaller. And that fishery in Indonesia is going to really affect that local population. It's going to decline quickly and precipitously. And that's also not good for that guy who's making a living off of mantas in Indonesia, right? He's going to lose them quite quickly and he's going to lose his livelihood. So the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. And that's really the essence of our research, understanding how these populations are structured. And the way that we're doing this is by trying to cover as many different spatial and temporal scales as possible. So what I mean by that is, for example, satellite tags, they tell us about daily movements, which is really important information, and they can cover, you know, thousands of miles, however far a manta swims, but they only last for about 6 months. And 6 months in the grand scheme of a manta's 50 or 60-year life is not necessarily that much. So then we can move up to other types of analyses, something called stable isotope analysis that we'll talk about, and genetics to cover those gaps. So we've got some really good data back from our satellite tags and also from this isotope analysis, and I'll talk about that today, and I'll maybe just say a little bit about the genetics at the end. So our study sites are mainly Indonesia and Mexico for the stuff I'll talk about today, although we are also working elsewhere in the Indo-Pacific. And to start off with the fun stuff, this is how we deploy a satellite tag. So basically we go to a cleaning station and we wait for these oceanic mantas to show up, and we let them get comfortable, and then we swim up behind them and we poke them with a pointy thing, and then often they'll swim off. Sometimes they'll kind of hang out and try and figure out what happened to them. And what we put on them are these archival satellite tags. So these are recording information about temperature, depth, and light level. But what we don't get is a daily position. So if you think about whales or turtles, some of these animals that maybe you've been on websites and you can see their daily movements, those animals are air breathers. So they come to the surface, you know, multiple times a day. And the tag on their back can transmit to satellites and tell them their position. Mantas aren't coming to the surface like that, and we're not able to transmit those satellite signals through the water. So instead, we have a tag that stays on the animal for 6 months, records all of this information, and then we can go back after the tag pops off and reconstruct those movements. And the whole 6 months we're sitting around biting our nails hoping that we hear from the tag. So we've put out a few dozen tags, both in Indonesia and in Mexico. I actually have 5 of them that are communicating right now, so I don't have the exact tracks back. And we've got a few more to put out and a few that we're waiting on. And so the questions that we can answer with these tags are, of course, this sort of overarching theme of how connected are these populations. So are mantas that we tag in Mexico swimming to Indonesia? Are they swimming to Peru and elsewhere? But we can also look at regional movements and get an idea of what critical habitats might be, if they're coming into contact with areas that we know are heavily fished. And then to that end, we can figure out if other options for protection, such as marine protected areas, might be effective for these species. So here we've got a few tag results just to give you an idea of what they look like. Unless you're a geography nerd, this probably is meaningless to you. This is the Bird's Head Peninsula in Indonesia. So right now we're in Raja Ampat by West Papua. And these black lines are the tag tracks. So these are where the mantas went. So what does that mean? Well, what we found, which came as quite a surprise to us, is that in the 6 months that all of our tags, these are just 2 examples, all of our tags so far, in the 6 months they've been attached, they've never left Indonesian waters. So that's a really unusual and important finding, right? So if you have mantas that are following the trend of other large marine species, so you've got leatherback turtles that are swimming from Indonesia to California to feed, you've got whales that are swimming from the poles down to the tropics. If mantas were following that trend, let's say they're swimming from Indonesia to California or Mexico, you need to get both Mexico and Indonesia and every country that they pass by in between to agree that they're worth protecting. If one of those countries says, no, I think we're going to fish them, they've spoiled it for everybody, right? And those mantas are no longer effectively protected. Now, if they're swimming through all those countries, the incentive for any one country to protect mantas is also greatly diminished. But what we found here is the complete opposite, that mantas are actually staying within Indonesia, which means that they're an Indonesian resource, which means that Indonesia stands to benefit from all those potential tourism dollars versus giving them up to fisheries for a much lower cost. So this was a really important finding. And working with a bunch of our local partners and with larger international conservation organizations, We brought this information along with a lot of other proposals and information to the Indonesian government, and they actually have, as of this year, protected all manta ray species in their waters, because it's now clear to them that they've got a resource which belongs to them and which they stand to benefit from. And they don't have to worry about mantas that they spend a lot of money protecting swimming off to the Philippines or swimming off to Sri Lanka and getting killed there after all of the effort has been gone into to protect them in Indonesia. So this was great. This was really encouraging for us. And what we wanted to do next was see if this pattern held up elsewhere in the world. Now, before I go on to that, I'll also just say, so here we've got the same data displayed now just as densities. So those dark circles just mean mantas spend a lot of time there. And when we look at marine protected areas in the region, we see that they're actually spending quite a bit of time inside a marine protected area, which for a large, supposedly wide-ranging animal like this is quite unlikely. So this is really interesting because it shows us that marine protected areas might actually be effective tools along with measures like national protection to prevent both targeted catch and also bycatch, which is a big issue for mantas as well. All right, so now we go over to Mexico, and you guys probably recognize the tip of Baja there, and we've got Puerto Vallarta. And in Mexico, we have two areas where we see oceanic mantas. We see them out at the Revillagigedo archipelago, which is about 250 miles off the coast. And we also see them in Bahía de Banderas. And we see some differences between these populations. Specifically, all the mantas that, or many of the mantas that we see in Bahía de Banderas are tangled up in fishing nets, they're wrapped up in fishing line, they've got scars from boats, some of them are missing cephalic fins that have been cut off by fishing line. And we don't see so much of that at the Revillagigedos. And so one of the questions we had is, are these actually the same population? And how does this connectivity between these two regions affect the vulnerability of mantas at either site to things like indirect fisheries? So the reason that this is important is in the 70s and 80s, the Sea of Cortez to the north here, the Gulf of California, was perhaps the most famous place on the planet to see manta rays. You could go and dive with them, you could ride them. Everybody was flocking there. And then in the 80s and 90s, there was a fishery for mantas and mobulas, which essentially wiped out oceanic mantas in the region. Now, mantas have been protected in Mexico for the last 20 years or so, but we haven't seen those mantas in the Gulf of California come back. And that pattern would be consistent with these being separate populations. So as we talked about before, if you have limited connectivity, once you remove a population, they're gone for good. But we weren't necessarily expecting it to occur on scales that were just, on hundreds of miles as opposed to thousands of miles. So again, we went and we started tagging. This is just one tag. We've got quite a few others, and they all show the same pattern. Mantas that we tag on the mainland stay near the mainland. Mantas that we tag out at the islands stay out at the islands. They do not seem to be crossing. So this suggests that we have this really fine-scale population structure, and that any one population, both in Mexico and elsewhere, is really, really vulnerable to fisheries. So we already talked about the caveats of tagging, which is that it only lasts for about 6 months. So all we get is that 6-month snapshot of what this animal is doing, which is about 1% of its life. So what we wanted to do is validate these findings. So then we can go and use this isotope analysis. So I'm not going to bore you with all the scientific details, but I will just say you represent your food in some way, isotopically. So we can pluck a hair from you, and we can tell if you've been eating hamburgers or kale. And the same goes for any animal, any organism really, anywhere in the world. And we also know that these isotope signatures vary between regions. So they'll look different on the coast of California, and they'll look different in Indonesia. And they'll also look different from mainland Mexico, for example, to offshore Mexico. So what we can tell is, let's pretend that you're a manta, and you're going on a road trip of the US, you've just retired and you want to see all the national parks. so if you're going and you're stopping at every burger joint along the way, you're going to make up some average of all the states that you visit, right? So you're going to fall somewhere in the middle here for your isotopic signature. Now, if you're more of a homebody, you've holed up in central Texas, you're going to have this level up here. And if you live up in the Northwest, you're going to be quite a bit lower. So you're going to look different. So if our mantas were traveling all over the world and they were feeding everywhere that they went, which presumably they would be, they would all kind of look the same. You'd have a big scatter. But in fact, what we find is that they break out quite nicely into little subgroups, which suggests that these two populations, for example, nearshore and offshore Mexico, and Sri Lanka and Mexico and Sri Lanka and Indonesia, are actually breaking out quite well. And these sorts of data tell us about 5 to 10 years. Okay, so that's quite a bit more, a much larger percentage of this lifespan than tagging. So basically what we've been able to do is validate our tag findings with stable isotope analysis. And the next step is moving up to genetics, which tells us about this sort of generational scale population connectivity. And we don't have all the final results on that yet, but they do seem to be corroborating all this other evidence quite well. So what does that mean? Well, it looks like we actually have this extreme of our hypothetical stories, that we've got mantas that have these really isolated subpopulations. So in a lot of ways, that's a bad thing, right? These populations are going to be smaller. Any local fishery is really going to impact that population. They're going to crash really quickly. And that's not such a great thing for anybody trying to make a living off of manta tourism. Now, at the same time, this provides a lot more incentive to a single country to protect those mantas, and it also makes it much more feasible from a logistical and a management standpoint to go ahead and protect them. They don't have to worry about, hey, if we spend $10 million to protect mantas in Mexico, they're going to swim to Peru and get caught, and we've wasted our money. So that's the bright side. Now, understanding how this population structure is occurring has also given us the ability to estimate some of these populations. So now we can start moving towards understanding what total population sizes are and how fisheries might be impacting them. So again, this research isn't done either, but we have some preliminary numbers. And with these photo ID databases, we've been able to look at populations in Indonesia, which have somewhere around low thousands of animals. And we have in Ecuador populations that are numbering in the tens of thousands. So those are orders of magnitude different. They're huge differences, and we think that those differences are related to food availability. So here in coastal South America, you have upwelling systems, you have lots of nutrients, just like in California here, and you have lots of food for mantas, basically. Now, in these nutrient-poor tropical regions like Indonesia, you probably have much lower food availability and therefore lower population sizes. Now, from a management standpoint, this means that no one-size-fits-all situation is going to really address this, right? You're going to need one scenario for Indonesia where you have maybe a subpopulation of 1,000 animals and a fishery of about 1,000 animals a year. And you've got a totally different scenario in Peru, let's say, where we might have 30,000 animals and only a handful that get caught every year. So they're completely different scenarios, and it's allowing us to really address these individual management plans so that we're not sort of just throwing out uninformed strategies. So that's a pretty good overview of the research that we do. There are a lot of collaborators here, so we have people working with us all over the world, loads of different funding and support. So a huge thanks to everybody that's involved. And a big thanks to all of you guys for your interest and attention, for coming tonight, and for Exploration for hosting the lecture. So I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
Yeah. You mentioned fisheries. Does that mean we fish for these creatures and then we eat them in some restaurant? I've never seen.
Yeah, so the question was about the fisheries and where they actually go. So the targeted fisheries for these guys are for their gill rakers. which are the structures that allow them to sieve zooplankton out of the water. And those are specifically for traditional Chinese medicine. So they get dried and they typically get sent to China and other parts of Southeast Asia. And so they're consumed some places. There are some small food fisheries in places like Peru. The fishery in Mexico for these animals was also a consumptive fishery. It was based on food. But the big problem right now are these fisheries for the gill rakers.
I see.
Yeah.
How do they actually do the fishing?
So the fishing is done a bunch of different ways. It depends on where you are. In Indonesia, for example. Thank you. In Indonesia, they fish them with harpoons. So they actually go alongside, they find them at the surface, and they harpoon them. In Sri Lanka, they use gill nets. So in Sri Lanka, it's really indiscriminate fishing. They just put out these drifting gill nets. They're going for tuna, sharks, and now mantas and modulas, and then they pull them up in the nets. So it depends on the place. Yeah?
If I go to the Long Beach Aquarium and I'm looking at the rays they have there, do they have some way of providing cleaning stations there for the rays?
I don't know about Long Beach. But yeah, I mean, I think that in most cases these aquariums are trying to make sort of a natural environment. Yeah. And so you'll often see down at the Birch Aquarium at Scripps, they've recreated an entire ecosystem. So they've got everything down from invertebrates up to leopard sharks and that sort of thing. And I believe that they're trying to fill all of those necessary roles. So I would imagine that they have, if the species that they have in there need that sort of cleaning behavior, they probably have cleaners. I don't know for sure though. Yeah.
What was the reason that the satellite tags only last for 6 months?
Well, you can have them, they can last for as long as you set them to last.
Oh, okay.
But usually there seems to be a trade-off. So the longer you put them on, they just have kind of a very small battery. So when they pop off and they're transmitting everything, they tend to die more quickly, and you don't actually get a whole lot more data back. So you can set them for kind of whatever you want. Yeah.
But it would seem to me that if you're studying the pelagic version as opposed to the reef version is probably staying on a reef and not going very far, especially in the deep areas of the Pacific. Mm-hmm. What you'd want to identify is where the pelagic, the deep water ones come to actually get cleaned, which is probably in shallower water where the cleaner fish can exist. And if you can identify those spots, you can then maybe keep those spots under some kind of identification and start to get a better idea of which ones come by at those cleaner stations when. Because what I've seen, having experienced this, is mantas tend to return to the same area, at least the reef versions tend to return to the same area on a consistent basis because they know what they're going to find. And if the pelagics did that too at cleaner stations, it would seem like that would be a really good place to start setting up the census.
So yes, and that's exactly what we do. So the question was about the methods for IDing these animals and where you can find them. So the oceanic mantas actually come to some of the exact same sites as the reef mantas do. So in Indonesia, we have sites where you can go to one cleaning station and see both species. And in Mexico, for example, there are essentially cleaning stations as well where they all come back. And that's where our photo ID databases really have the lion's share of their work. So every time either a researcher sees a manta, or in some cases we have people submitting images to our databases, we get those photos at the cleaning stations. And it's actually those resightings that you mentioned. So when you see an animal again 2 years, 5 years, 10 years later, that information is actually what allows us to estimate the populations. Yeah?
So the population in Sea of Cortez has vanished. Are you aware of other areas where they were in abundance and are now no longer?
Mm-hmm. So the question was about other examples of manta populations that have been wiped out. Yeah, there are a few. We don't have great numbers on this. There haven't been that many places where they've been basically wiped out, but there are some instances in West Africa and Mozambique where they've recorded what they think is about an 80% decline in mantas over the last 10 years or so. There's really not great information on that. In the Sea of Cortez, they were essentially wiped out, and then in the last 2 or 3 years, people have started seeing them again. So that's what we might expect if there's a really low level of connectivity where you get the occasional manta coming in. But that's the sort of thing where, you know, we wouldn't expect to see these populations come back to their previous abundance for decades, if not centuries, because it's such a sort of limited connectivity. Yeah?
Is the orca the only natural predator of the manta?
So the question was about natural predators. So the orcas are the only ones I know of that, that actually can eat a whole manta. Sharks will come and they'll, you know, have hors d'oeuvres and take a bite out, but the mantas tend to survive those interactions. Yeah.
Okay, these guys eat zooplanktons.
Mm-hmm.
If the population decreases or disappears, aside from having a lot of very, very happy zooplanktons, what happens? Who moves in?
Yeah, so the question...
What other changes does it make to the system in that area?
The question was, if we remove mantas, what happens? What happens to the ecosystem? And so I think where you're probably going with that is that, for example, if we remove sharks, we get trophic cascades. So you remove a top predator, and that releases a mesopredator, you know, some fishes below it, which then deplete the next trophic level down, and so on. So you have these cascades all throughout the system. Now, mantas are not a top predator. They're feeding really low down on the food chain. And so the short answer is that we don't really know what's going to happen if you remove all these animals. There's a chance that you'd have an ecosystem that's pretty much intact, despite having removed them. There's been some indication that these guys serve as a biological pump from surface waters to these deep bathypelagic zones where they're going down potentially to feed. So there's not a whole lot of exchange between the deep ocean and the surface ocean as far as you know, actual animals. And so mantas potentially and mobulas are going to these depths, eating quite a bit, and then coming up to the surface, and they're exchanging energy as parasites or you know, feces or whatever. So that's one possibility. Again, the scale of that interaction, how many mantas are actually out there feeding, and what's that transfer. There's also been suggestion that, for example, removing whales from a system, which is a sort of analogous situation. So you've got whales, which are also feeding very low down on the food chain. If you remove them, what happens to the system? And there's been some work to show that by removing whales, you're actually removing a food source for predators like orcas, which then results in orcas feeding more heavily on sea lions and pinnipeds and that sort of thing, which causes its own sort of cascade. I have absolutely no evidence, we haven't looked at this, but you might expect something similar if you're removing a potential food source. We don't really know how much of a food source mantas serve to animals like sharks and so on. We know in places like Mozambique, we see lots of these scars where sharks have clearly been chomping on them. So, you know, there's a possibility there. But I guess the short answer to your question is we don't really know what would happen. But it would be a shame if we had to find out. So, yeah.
Have you done any research as to their behavior as related to their large brain?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are a few mantas in captivity. And recently, I don't think this is published yet, they were actually able to take a mirror down and put a manta in front of a mirror. And so this is a test that they do with dolphins and other animals, primates, that sort of thing, to see if they're self-aware. So if you put a dolphin in front of a mirror, they'll look at themselves and they know that they are looking at themselves. And so the same has been done with mantas now, and it's been shown that they can actually recognize themselves. So they can look in a mirror and they can figure out that they're looking at themselves. And they can see marks and things that you put on them and investigate and see what the difference is. What else? I mean, all these complex social interactions that we see are definitely evidence of what they might be doing, especially because the areas of the brain that are enlarged are generally associated with that sort of socializing behavior. They also seem to be able to recognize individual people. So, you know, not many of us can identify an individual manta without looking at its belly. But a story that I'm particularly fond of, a colleague of mine who works in the Maldives, he cut some fishing line off of a manta once. So there was a manta that was covered head to toe in fishing line. It cuts through them like cheese wire. And this manta came up and allowed him to cut the fishing line off like a big cleaner fish. So that's interesting in itself. But 3 or 4 days later, Guy, my colleague, was in that same bay, and he was filming with a crew of BBC filmmakers. And they were all sitting there in a group of divers, which presumably you would think to a manta all kind of look the same. We've all got bubbles coming out, we're all wearing black wetsuits, we all have masks on. And out of this feeding vortex that they were watching, one manta popped out and was hovering around Guy's head. Not any of the filmmakers or anybody else there. He picked out Guy, which I could hardly recognize Guy, I'm sure, underwater in a wetsuit. And this manta just hung out for 10 or 20 minutes. He stopped feeding, hung out with him, and then eventually went back to feeding. So it's clear that, you know, these enhanced brain regions, and there are stories like this all over the place. You hear these sorts of things frequently. So it's clear that they have some sort of, I want to say on an emotional level, some higher level of intelligence beyond just your average fish. And I think that anybody who spends time in the water with them can really feel that and observe that.
How powerful are their eyes? They go from at the surface to, you said, a couple thousand feet below. Mm-hmm. What are their eyeballs like? Do they see in color, black and white? What do we know about that?
Sure. I do believe there's some information out there. I don't personally know any of it, but we do know that the cephalic fins, so these guys, the horns, if you will, those have really high densities of electroreceptors. Huh. And so if a manta swims by you with their cephalic fins rolled up in swimming mode, if you will, hydrodynamic swimming mode, they'll often unroll, and it looks kind of like they're waving at you, and people love it. They go, oh, the manta's waving at me. But actually what they're doing is they're investigating you with their cephalic fin. And that, I would say, is probably how they're getting around, how they're finding food when they're going down to these depths where you probably can't see anything. They've got these electroreceptors. They can probably, you know, figure out if they're swimming through a swarm of zooplankton or open water or what.
Well, I've been diving with these in Kona and the Manta Ray many times. And you can tell when they swim by you because they're very close, so within a foot of you. You can watch the eye track you as they go by. So
absolutely.
That's totally
wild. Have you noticed that? 30 feet down there.
And back, yeah.
The map of the populations that you showed was primarily Pacific and Indian Ocean. Is it, how low is the population in Atlantic? Is that from Atlantic and Caribbean? Is that from fishing?
Sure.
Or is that
That's a good program.
So the question was about the populations in the Atlantic and Caribbean. So everything that we've talked about today so far has been mainly focused on the Indian and Pacific Oceans, mostly because that's where most of my work happens. I would say that we know a lot less about the Caribbean and Atlantic. There are a few of these aggregation sites, 3 or 4 of them that I know of. But throughout most of the Caribbean, there's not sort of, you can see a manta basically anywhere in the Caribbean, but there are not that many sites that you can go to and reliably see them. So it's harder to get a feel for structure and connectivity. There are a few sites in Mexico near Cancun that has a seasonal aggregation. Flower Garden Banks in Texas has an aggregation. Some parts of Florida. So they're definitely around, but we have we don't have as good an idea of what's happening in the Caribbean and Atlantic. The Caribbean is actually where that putative third species might be that we're working on figuring out what's going on there. Yeah.
Do you think there's any correlation between the cycling of El Nino and their fecundity or parturition?
Sure. So the question was if there's any relationship between El Nino events and fecundity and other factors with mantas. And I would say we don't have a whole lot of good evidence, but I would say probably yes. So El Nino is a massive influence on all sorts of marine species. And I would be surprised if it didn't affect mantas. So mantas, they have these 50-year plus lifespans, and they're not giving birth every single year. And so, you know, it's probably not affecting them the same way it affects seabirds, for example, which, you know, in some cases will just not lay eggs in a bad El Nino year. But I'm sure it has some effect. So mantas and and mobulas and other eagle rays and that sort of thing, they can actually store sperm and choose when to become pregnant after they mate. And there's some evidence to suggest that they might wait until it's a year when they expect that there will be plenty of food around for them and their offspring. And so, you know, that's, I could imagine that being a potential factor. Yeah. Yeah.
That relatively larger fish at that -30-degree angle, is that a parasite of some sort?
No, this is a remora. So remoras are commensal fishes. It's a type of symbiosis in which this remora benefits. It sticks to the manta, and when the manta finds a nice patch of plankton, the remora will detach and feed. But it doesn't really negatively affect the manta, so we don't call it a parasite. It's sort of like the remora wins and the manta stays even. So that's commensalism, technically. Yeah?
Is it possible to study them in captivity, or do you have to study them in their habitat?
Yeah, there are a few mantas in captivity. It's really hard to keep them alive and healthy and happy in captivity since they're so big and a little bit finicky. There are a few aquariums around the world that have mantas, and there are some people studying them in captivity. One really interesting paper just recently showed that they're able to change colors, which we think that might allow them to communicate with each other. And that was only done, you could only do that in captivity because you know it's hard to monitor a manta for long enough to observe that. They were also able to do MRIs of pregnant manta in captivity and see that there's actually a buccal pump. They basically nurse their babies in the womb, which is something you absolutely could not do in the wild. So there are some things that having an animal in captivity allows us, or well, not me, but allows us as researchers in general to do. Yeah.
If they're frequently caught in fishermen's fishing lines, and they feed on zooplankton, how do the sardines and the hooks get associated with the manta?
Mm-hmm. So the question was, if mantas are feeding on zooplankton, why are they interacting with fishing lines that would presumably be going for tunas and things like that? And it's basically an accidental entanglement. So they're not actually, going for the bait or anything like that. It would be if there's a fishing line either still attached to the rod or just what we call ghost nets and ghost gear that's just floating freely. They get entangled in that really easily. And it can be nets and fishing line and all sorts of things. Yeah.
So genetically, how varied are the two species you're talking about?
Mm-hmm.
And how genetically, how much variation do you expect to see between the different populations? Onshore, offshore, this and that.
Sure. So what we're finding, the reef and oceanic mantas have been verified as two species genetically. And so the variation, you don't need a lot of variation, you just need consistent variation, if that makes sense. So it doesn't have to be a huge difference. It could just be one, if you guys remember your A's and T's and C's and G's from biology, it could just be one A versus one T, as long as it's always an A in a reef manta and always a T in an oceanic manta. So it doesn't have to be a lot of diversity, it just has to be consistent. What you might expect is that the closer two populations are together, the more related they would be, even if they are separate populations. But actually, just preliminary results, what I've been looking at so far is actually suggesting that these two sites in Mexico are almost as different from each other as one of these sites in Mexico to a site in Sri Lanka.
Wow.
So, they're a little more related, which you'd expect, but it's sort of at the same scale. And so it looks like they're actually breaking out quite consistently as separate populations. Yeah.
How big are the offspring and how rapidly do they grow?
So the offspring, the question was how big the babies are and how quickly they grow. They come out about 1.6 meters across, so they come out around 6 feet. They're huge when they come out, and that's why they're completely self-sufficient. Yeah, you think you have it bad, ladies? No. So they come out, and we don't know much after that. We have really no reliable ways of aging mantas. That's one of the priorities that we're working on right now, is figuring out how we can age them. But because we don't have a good way to age them, we don't really know a whole lot about how quickly they grow. Or, you know, if you catch an animal and you know how old it is, you can learn a lot. But right now we're in the dark about that. Yeah?
In their long life, and they only have one pregnancy, do the males continue to breed with females if they can find one that hasn't already had a baby?
Sure. So the question was about how frequently females versus males are breeding. The females get pregnant on average once every 5 to 7 years. So across their life, they might, you know, have somewhere between 6 and 10 or 12 pups. We think that the males, because you can see males that are joining multiple mating trains, you know, frequently. So it seems like they're probably mating more often whenever they can, right? So it's a lot less expensive for them to mate than it is for a female. So, yeah.
Tell us a little about the tail. Is that defensive or?
Sure. So the tails, they do not have those defensive barbs that you find on stingrays and on other closely related, even other mobula species have these spines. Mantas are so large that they've basically evolved out of any active defenses, and they rely on this immense size and sort of their shape as well. So you can imagine there aren't that many angles you can get at a manta from. You know, you can't really get them unless you've got a huge mouth like an orca. You can't really get them from below. You can't get them from above. They'll see you coming from the front, and they'll, you know, often they get a chunk out of the back. So, you know, we've sort of discussed this. We don't have a good answer, but we've sort of put forward the idea that maybe having a long tail has some sort of warning indicator. If something's coming up behind you, you can feel a little bit of water movement. We also have found that the tails get shorter as they get older because things are biting it off at the cleaning stations, triggerfish and that sort of thing. So it's not a reliable way to age an animal, but, you know, if it's got a really short tail, sometimes we think, oh, it's probably a little bit older than that guy with the nice long tail. But yeah.
Ear bones? They don't have ear bones you can age them?
So the question was about aging them with ear bones. We do that in fish with what are called otoliths, which are these little marbles, basically. And every year they put on a ring, which you can then cut in half, and you can read it like a tree ring, basically. No, mantas don't have those. So one of the problems is that they're entirely cartilage. They don't have any bony parts. And so it's hard. If you can get a vertebrae from a shark, you can still age it, even though it's cartilage. But we've had a really hard time trying to get a vertebrae from a manta, even in the fisheries and that sort of thing. So far we're drawing blanks.
What's the nature of your research? What are you specifically looking at now?
So what I'm specifically looking at is where population structuring is occurring, so how connected these populations are using the satellite tags, the isotopes, and the genetics. And then with that information, we're trying to build management strategies and priority regions and get a better understanding of which populations are most vulnerable. And also with that structuring information, we can then do these population assessments, so we can get some of the first estimates of how large the populations are and how fisheries are impacting them. I think you had a question too.
In the juveniles, among the juveniles, it would appear that there ought to be a rather high mortality rate. Is there? And what is the reason?
Sure. The question is there a high mortality rate in juveniles? We have no idea. So there's been one manta live birth in the wild ever recorded. So we don't see it very often. So it's really hard for us to keep track of the juveniles. We also rarely see juveniles in the wild. So you see adults all the time, and it seems like the juveniles are segregating themselves. They're somewhere else, maybe offshore in deep water. And for example, the fishery in Sri Lanka catches 95% juveniles. So wherever they're fishing, they're catching mostly juveniles. And we can't access those areas. We don't know where to go, basically, as researchers who are using diving and in-water observation. So it's really hard for us to have, we basically have no information on the juveniles because we just simply can't find them with the methods that we're using right now. Yeah?
Would that mean you don't know the gestation period either?
We know the gestation period because there have been live births in captivity. So it's about 13 months.
Okay.
You go and talk to him. I have a question too.
He'll be here to answer more questions for you. I just want to kind of be true to our time frame here. And let's give Josh another round of applause. That's quite spectacular.